I have a little quote that I have framed in my office. It's from Seneca. He says, too many people lack the fickleness to live as they should and instead simply live as they have begun. So I think
Mm,
one of the things that happens is a set of assumptions or a path made sense at a time, or a setup or an arrangement made sense at a time where we just didn't have anything better. And so we start doing a thing and then we lack that sort of fickleness is an interesting word because we see it mostly as a negative word, but we lack the ability to be to tweak and to change and to experiment to try to potentially find something better. So we just keep going down the path that we always went. We were choosing majors in college, and one
mm.
seemed slightly more interesting than another. And then 40 years later, we're still lawyers, even though we don't actually like this thing anymore. And we didn't even know that much about it when we decided to go to law school or whatever. Insert any path that you can take in your life for law school and being a lawyer there. But this idea of like, I moved here because it made sense at the time does not mean you have to continue out your days that way. Or you're a person who wakes up early, maybe you're actually a night owl, or your business keeps you up late, and so you don't know that actually you're a morning person. But this willingness to tweak and experiment and try different ways of doing things, that's how you ultimately do get to that day-to-day satisfaction that we're talking about.
Yeah, Seneca says fickleness, but maybe in modern language we would say like adaptability or being
Yeah.
flexible. You know, it's
Hmm.
you don't have this rigid way of living life. Like if you need things to be a certain way, then you're being held hostage by the situation. You know, it's actually the what's that quote? It's something like the oak tree fought against the storm and broke, but the willow tree bent and survived. And it's like you
Hmm.
need some amount of, you know, flexibility and adaptability. It's actually the flexible and supple things in life that survive, and it's the rigid and fixed things that break and are brittle. And so I think there's that line by Lao Tzu where he says like the way of the living is to bend and to adjust, and the way of the dead is to, you know, be brittle and rigid. Um, and so there's a lot of that. Sometimes we talk about consistency as like this rigidness, you know, this discipline. Oh, to
Yeah.
be consistent, it means to be the type of person who always grits through it, always makes it happen, no matter the conditions of the situation. But in real life, I think consistency is often adaptability. It's flexibility. It's when you don't have enough time, you do it in the short way or the smaller way. When you don't have enough energy, you do it in the easy way. When you don't have the skills, you figure out a way to do it, you know, in a more beginner style. And so it's the ability to flex and adjust to the circumstances, but not throw up a zero for that day
Yeah.
to still show up. That is actually what consistency looks like. And of course, we all want to perform, you know, better and to try to do more, but it's actually not letting 0 days creep in. That
Yeah.
is what consistency really looks like.
Yeah. I read about this NFL kicker once who, like, he was anti-ritual. Like, he didn't ever want to be like, these are my lucky socks, this is the way I trot on the field. Like, he was really almost paranoid about not creating patterns because then you need them to be a certain way. And I
Mm,
think if you're a habit oriented person or a routine oriented person, it can almost become like a sort of a religious thing or a compulsion where you're like, I have to have it this way. And that's great insofar as you can control your environment day to day, but the reality is you can't. Like, when I talk, I try to think, here's the system or the order of things that I like to do it in to get the best performance. But I also kind of lean into those days where that gets blown apart because the flight is delayed or I'm
hmm
sick or something happened. I go like, this is me getting practice doing it in a different way so I can feel comfortable knowing that whatever the circumstances are, I can perform, that I'm not so rigid that I'm actually fragile.
hmm There's an interesting story about Josh Waitzkin. You know him, he did
Yeah.
the chess guy and then martial arts and whatever. That he was doing this martial arts competition. It was like the national championships or something, and there was I think he was in Thailand or Taiwan or, you know, somewhere where English was not the primary language, and there was a mix up in the schedule. He thought that he was performing at a, you know, a later time, and so he was taking a nap on the bleachers. He thought he was competing like 6 hours from then. And they came up and woke him up and they said, hey, actually, you're supposed to be on the mat in like 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And you need to walk across the, you know, the stadium or whatever. And so he went from being asleep to needing to compete in this high level competition like right away. And he said earlier in his career, he had this pregame routine, this ritual, like you had mentioned, like a lot of athletes do, where it was like 12 minutes or 10 minutes. And then eventually what he started to do was he started to compress it.
Yeah.
And, in that moment, he didn't have 12 minutes, but he had already practiced compressing it down. Eventually, I think he got it down to something under like 30 seconds. And he could just do that little ritual in, 15 seconds and be ready to compete. And that I like that, that kind of thinking of like, okay, it is nice to have an on switch where you feel
Yeah.
like, okay, I need to be ready to go now, and I need to have some signal to my brain that we're getting started. But the more that you can compress that sequence, the less brittle, as you say, you are. If you need to step on a leaf and walk counterclockwise 3 times and go through some mantra, like you don't have time for that.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's
Especially
a
when you have kids, because your life is just an endless series of your routines being being blown apart. And not only if sort of religiously sticking to those routines, it's not just unrealistic. If you were to somehow manage to do it, it's coming at the expense of someone else, right? You by nature, your comfort and your way of doing things is no longer the priority. So you have to kind of get good at being like, resilience to me is the ability to perform and continue to operate no matter what's happening. And so if you need it to be a certain way, you're not resilient. You're the opposite of resilient.
right. Yeah, the more you are more mentally tough if your mood and your performance is not dependent on your conditions. If
Yes.
you're dependent on favorable conditions, you're actually not that tough.